Κυρίες και κύριοι, καλησπέρα σας. Σήμερα έχουμε τη χαρά να φιλοξενούμε μέσα από την τηλεόραση της Βουλής των Ελλήνων τον καθηγητή Γκάρι Μπανκς, Πρύτανη της Σχολής Δημόσιας Διοίκησης της Αυστραλίας και Νέας Ζηλανδίας. Ο κύριος Μπανκς βρίσκεται στη χώρα μας και στη Βουλή των Ελλήνων στο πλαίσιο ομιλίας του σε επιτροπές της Βουλής με θέμα χρηστή διακυβέρνηση και διαφάνεια και αντιμετώπιση των φαινομένων διαφθοράς. Mr. Banks, welcome to Greece and to the Hellenic Parliament.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, what is the purpose of your visit? You are going to present the Australian experience in what has to do with economics.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about Australia's structural reforms, a process we've been through, and I'm on my way to Paris to a meeting of the OECD where I chair one of the committees, the Regulatory Policy Committee, and the opportunity came to come to Athens and talk about Australia's experience. And I love Greece, I love Athens, so it was a good opportunity to spend one day, 2 days in Athens.
So what kind of reforms were undertaken in Australia in order to lead to the prosperity?
Well, as you know, Australia, by international rankings, currently has done very well. We've come out of the global financial crisis in relatively good shape. The origins of that good success for Australia today is in reforms that Australia undertook in the 1980s and 1990s. In the late 1970s and early 80s, Australia was in trouble. Our economy was very rigid. We had high inflation, we had big deficits, we had unemployment rising, and at the time...
What was the reason for that?
Well, I'd say in one word, excessive regulation and excessive spending. We were regulating too much and we were spending too much. And we'd gone from a position where Australia at the beginning of the 20th century was ranked number one in the world in terms of per capita GDP. By 1980 we'd come down to about 18th or 19th. And our Treasurer, our Minister of Finance, was famous for saying that if we continued like this, we would become a banana republic. And this galvanised a public debate about the need to change and the need to reform in Australia.
So the Productivity Commission was established at this time, and what was the role? You've been chairman.
So an important part of the Australian story is that we've had some organisations within government whose job it has been to provide evidence and research about the problems and the solutions, and to explain them to the public and to provide some recommendations to the government. And I've
we are
chaired
talking about
an
independent source.
So an independent organisation. So my organisation, the Productivity Commission, is an independent body with commissioners who are appointed almost like judges. They have a position, a secure position for 5 years. And their job is to conduct inquiries into key issues of public policy and economic management, and also to educate the public about the issues and the problems and to do some good quality research. So this has been an important part of the story in Australia, that we've had an evidence base for a number of the reforms that we undertook from the 80s forward, which have made a big difference to our economy.
So how long has it taken in order to reverse the economic situation?
The story of structural reform is that it does not happen overnight. It takes time.
2 decades.
Well, in our case, we started in the early 80s, and it really took until the late 90s before people were feeling that we'd achieved a lot. So that by the time of first of all, the Asian financial crisis at the end of the 80s, and then the global financial crisis, a lot of the reforms had been in place, and the Australian economy had raised its productivity. It was more flexible, it was a more dynamic, more competitive economy, and it was in better shape to withstand some of these pressures. But it took a long time, and the politics of it were not easy, because structural reform means that somebody's going to lose something in the short term for the benefit of the community in the long term.
That's what I was going to ask. If the changes have been painful for the citizens, I mean taxation, low salaries, austerity measures, unemployment.
Interestingly enough, in Australia, and we can talk a little bit about the reason for this, there was some pain. Some people lost their jobs. But
even in the public sector?
Including in the public sector, there were some people who lost their jobs. But the deregulation, the privatisations, the removal of red tape led to a lot of jobs being created at the same time. So if you look at a chart in Australia of reform with reduction in protection and regulation, and you look at what happened with jobs, you also see that jobs were increasing.
Yeah, but the job offer was immediate?
Not always immediate.
Time.
So in Australia we had a structural adjustment program so that people who lost their jobs were given some support, some training support to help them find new jobs. But soon the dynamism of the economy meant that many of those people found new jobs, not necessarily in the same industry, but in another industry. And importantly, over time, real wages were increasing, so that the productivity improvement that occurred through the structural reforms, which meant that we're getting more output for every job, meant that ultimately people were getting higher incomes in work, but they may have had to move from one industry to another.
Did you have problem with corruption or bureaucracy? These are things that we have to deal with, we are trying to deal with in our country.
I think every country has to deal with potential for corruption and so on. In Australia, it has not been a big problem. There have been a range of reforms put in place to increase the transparency of government, to make information available, and indeed through just the courts and the regulations, there are quite significant penalties for corrupt behaviour. So this was not Australia's problem so much. The problem Australia had was too much red tape, too much regulation, lack of incentive for people to start up new businesses and to employ people. It was a problem of an economy that was becoming far too rigid and inflexible. And so the structural reforms that began in the early 80s with the reduction of our import barriers, and then moved into reforms in the infrastructure area and so on, and ultimately reforms in education and public administration, were reforms that really opened up the economy and made the economy far more productive and as I said, able to withstand some of the troubled times that were to come.
Did you have tax evasion in Australia?
Again, I think wherever you have taxes and wherever you have people, you have tax evasion. It's the natural inclination of everybody to pay. One of our famous businessmen said, why should I pay more tax than I have to?
Yes.
But
you know, in Greece we have heavy taxation in property.
So every country has a range of taxes and the mix of taxes changes. In Australia, the taxes on property are not so high, but income taxes have been very high. And when income taxes are high, that creates an incentive for people to do different things. But the tax administration is quite effective in Australia, and so not too many people have escaped paying their taxes, although people always complain that the wealthiest people pay the least tax. But when you talk to wealthy people, they tell you they pay a lot of tax. So there's always a tax story, I think, and the challenge is to come up with an administration that can apply the taxation rules fairly, but also have rules that the people perceive to be rules that everybody should be following.
What about enterprises, the taxation?
So corporate taxation is equally an important part of the overall tax take in Australia. And when we had our mining boom, a lot of money was generated from the mining sector through the export boom to China, which came through the taxation system. But this encouraged a big debate in Australia. Are we taking enough taxation from the miners, or are they profiting from Australian minerals at the public's expense? So we've had a big debate about taxation in Australia, and it's not over yet. There are people who feel they pay too much tax, and people who feel that
they escape from tax.
Escape from tax. So again, there are similarities between Greece and Australia and probably a lot of other countries, and the challenge is to do these things in a way that could get broad acceptance. So again, my organisation, while we haven't done a lot of work on tax, an important part of what we do is to explain why a tax regime would be more efficient in one way than another, why property taxes, for example, can be efficient if they're designed in a particular way, why sometimes it's bad to have high income taxes, and while taxes on consumption can be more efficient. So a big discussion about tax has been an important part of the Australian story.
Mr. Banks, you have said that the ongoing reforms have to be facilitated beyond the life of any government. In your country, you didn't have opposition parties or unions that reacted to changes to restructuring?
The politics of reform are always difficult. In Australia, we were fortunate that through the period of the big reforms in the 80s, we had oppositions that were supportive of the reforms of the government. So the government had the position of getting support from the opposition parties for reforms. That was because in Australia in the 1980s, everybody realised that we were in trouble and that we needed to conduct these reforms if we were to get out of trouble. So there was a broad consensus politically. Now, I won't say every party agreed, but the main parties, the government and the opposition, the majority agreed that reform was needed. Indeed, in some cases, the opposition was pushing the government to reform even harder, which made it easier for the government to do what it was doing.
So the reforms never stuck, you mean?
No, the reform, this is the thing that's happened in Australia. There was a lot of discussion about the reforms. There was support from the opposition, and the reforms did endure, but they endured beyond the life of each government. So when the governments changed, the reform process continued because there'd been a broad agreement within society that these reforms were needed. So there was a continuity, and again, this is a particular difference between Australia and New Zealand, where in New Zealand the reforms occurred with less public discussion and agreement, and when the government changed, sometimes the reforms went backwards. That's right.
Okay. This Australian experience has helped other countries so far?
Well, in what sense do you mean that?
In general, you're giving your experience, talking to people, if they have done some things from the Australian experience.
Well, what's interesting
to their lives, to their countries,
yeah, well,
and if they can be applied in Greece as well.
Well, this is the thing. You see, every country is different. Every country has different institutions, and I wouldn't pretend that, for example, my organisation could apply in Latin America or in Europe or in China. But in all of those places, there's a lot of interest in how Australia has gone about its reforms, and in particular, the use of independent research institutions to provide information that's trusted by the public and that can provide a basis for an agreed reform process where people can understand what the benefits are going to be as well as the costs, and that this is done in a transparent way. So Australia has managed to do this. Typically, the reform debate gets hijacked by vested interests that have a particular interest in some aspect of industry or the finance sector or whatever, and they become the loudest voices. In Australia, we have those voices too, but we've also had the voices of independent institutions that have been able to provide, I suppose, an honest broker for the government and for the public as to who is right and what should be done. So
the politicians have to convince the public that it's for their benefit what they decide.
Well, that's always true.
To reform and change.
That's always true. But what's happened in Australia is that my organisation in particular has been able to provide evidence and arguments for the politicians, support for them really in conveying to the public that reform is needed and the reasons for it, and that there will be gains from this, so that it's not just... People are always suspicious of politicians.
Yes.
It's suspicious in Australia, in Greece, I'm sure, and in other countries. So to have...
with no reason. They are suspicious.
Of course. But so my organisation has been able to help the politicians by providing independent information that the people trust, that they can use in arguing the case for reform.
So how long do you estimate that it will take to Greece to overcome the difficulties?
Look, I wouldn't pretend to be an expert in Greece. All I can say is that in Australia, in the mid-1980s, we were in trouble. By the mid-1990s, we had a productivity boom such as our country had never seen before. So within a decade, we were starting to see real improvements. But even through that decade, we didn't have the really negative effects that a lot of people had anticipated. Every country has a lot of vitality and potential if it can be untapped, and this is the issue: finding ways in each country of addressing the regulatory or other problems that may be holding back the vitality of the economy. But you know that in Greece we have an unemployment that reaches approximately 30%. Yes, it's a big. This is very high, and. Dealing with unemployment of that kind, I think, is a big challenge for any country. In Australia, an important part of reducing unemployment from quite high levels for Australia that we had in the 80s, but it was more like 10%, which was already seen as very high in Australia. was to make the labour market a little bit more flexible, to make it easier for employers to employ people, and to have less central control over wage setting and conditions, so that enterprises had a bit more flexibility to take people on board, and if they had to let them go because they weren't performing, well, they could let them go. So those changes meant that job creation was quite strong through the reform period.
So in Greece, in which domain should we emphasize in order to restructure and to give a boost to production?
Ultimately, the well-being of a society, the living standards of people depend on the productivity of the economy. So there are really only two ways that you can increase the income per person in a country. One is by raising productivity, or secondly, if you're lucky, as Australia has been recently, from high terms of trade and high export prices. But ultimately, productivity, getting more output for every person is the answer. So each country needs to look at the issues that may be impeding productivity, and it comes down to the ability of an enterprise to be productive. In Australia, we have a framework that we think about when we think about productivity, and we look at the incentives for firms to be productive, but we also look at whether they have the flexibility to be productive and they have the capability. Now, I'm sure in Australia and in Greece we have very capable people, so the things that are holding our people back tend to be more the regulations that are restricting flexibility or lack of incentives, because people don't face the pressures of the market to find the most productive and innovative ways of doing business.
Mr. Banks, restructuring means give space to the private sector. I mean, the state cannot manage its own property.
Well, no, that's not so. In Australia, privatisation was part of the story, but not a big part. So competition was a far bigger part of the Australian story of reform than privatisation. So Australia took the view that it didn't matter who owned the assets, provided there was competition and there was an opportunity for private players to come in and compete with the public sector. So a lot of the competition reforms in Australia were really about improving the competitive forces rather than ownership of who should own the assets. But over time it became clear that in a number of areas the private industries were producing things far better than the government, and so it became natural then for that to happen. But that wasn't the beginning. The beginning was really opening up the economy and also a lot of public services to competition.
At this moment, do you have an increase of migration from Greece to Australia, and in which areas?
This is a question I wish I had the answers to for you and your listeners. I mean, Australia has had very significant migration from Greece. Most of that came in the post-war period through the 50s and 60s. I think it's at a much smaller level, and I'm not sure that there's been any recent increase. I do understand that there has been an increase from Italy, for example, but I noticed that just because my office is in the Italian quarter of Melbourne, where I see many more Italians. But Australia has a very high migration intake, and more recent years a lot of people have come from Asia, and also from the more conflicted areas like in Africa and in some of the parts of the Middle East. So I think there's a continuing migration from Greece, but it hasn't increased relative to what it has been in the past.
Because of the crisis?
There's no, as I say, I'm not an expert on this, but so far we've not detected that there's been a particular increase that's come about as a result of the crisis. But as you would well know, Australia has a large Greek population. In fact, Melbourne, where I now live, has the third largest concentration of Greeks, I think, outside Athens and Thessalonica.
Yes.
So it's a place where I'm sure Greeks would come and they'd find family, they'd find friends, and find a congenial place to live and work.
So, Mr. Banks, what would you say to Greek people in order to give them a hope that the situation can be reversed?
Well, the Australian situation shows that with effort, with time, and with good policies and with broad support of the community, amazing things can happen. I think every country has the seeds of dynamism, but each of us in our own way find ways of suppressing those forces of spontaneity in our economies. So regulatory reforms and structural reforms, I think, are ways of ultimately making people as a whole within the community better off. Australia's experience is that that doesn't happen overnight, but it can happen within a sufficiently quick period of time that people can notice improvements. So if someone went to Australia in 1985 and they went to Melbourne and they walked around the city and then they went back 10 years later, they would have noticed the difference.
Yes.
It's a far more prosperous place now, and Australia is a far more prosperous place than it was 10 years ago. So my advice to Greece, to the extent that I can base that on Australian experience, is that reform will deliver benefits. You have to be patient, and it needs broad support for it to be sustained. But in the end, it will bring big benefits.
Mr. Banks, thank you very much for this conversation.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Κυρίες και κύριοι, ήταν ο καθηγητής Γκάρι Μπανκς, Πρύτανη της Σχολής Δημόσιας Διοίκησης της Αυστραλίας και Νέας Ζηλανδίας, φιλοξενούμενος της Βουλής των Ελλήνων. Σας ευχαριστούμε που μας παρακολουθήσατε. Καλό σας βράδυ.